Welcome everyone to this session of building your client base with podcasting with amazing Chris. So we thought that we have in Juno with our events, we have tried all sorts of lead generation events before, but they were very traditional in some ways. So it was generate your leads through LinkedIn, generate your leads through social media, etc., etc. But we have never tried anything as unique as build your client base, build your expertise with podcasting. So I feel that we are quite original in this sense. So I'm very, very excited to hear this talk today. So Chris, over to you.
Nice. Thank you so much, Eva. So everybody sees my screen, presentations moving.
Yes.
We're good. Okay. All right. So podcasting, why podcasting? I wanted to do a brief introduction first. And I'm quite bullish on podcasting, especially because in today's age, with AI and everything, all the content that you see, we are getting overwhelmed by it. And podcasting, I think it's the only probably communication tool or content methodology that actually has a superpower, like a secret weapon, which is creates relationships, especially if you do an interview style podcasting, which is what I'm doing. And also the particularity of speaking directly inside your audience's heads. So when people listen to podcasts, your message goes directly inside their heads. And that, I think, is something that no other medium can do. And also when you do it in a very niche, specialized way for your specific business, I think it's got a very unique potential to differentiate you, create your brand, build your brand, freelancing brand, and yeah, in general, build your authority. So let's get started. In today's kind of workshop, we are looking at planning and launching your authority podcast, finding and booking guests, editing, promoting, and repurposing your podcast. And then we'll finish up with a couple of questions if you have any. So first, a quick introduction of who am I. So I'm Chris. I worked 10 years as a software engineer, and then I decided that I didn't want to do all of that anymore. I wanted to play with my band, so I wanted something more flexible, and that's when I stumbled on conversion copywriting. So I did that for a couple of years on my own. Then I started working at an agency as a UX designer, UX lead, where I learned a lot of other new skills. And finally, in 2021, I decided to go back again on my own as a conversion alchemist, which is what I called. It's kind of the mix of messaging, copywriting, and UX. So I tried to combine everything that I've learned through the years in what I'm doing now. What is our goal today? So our goal is to build a product you're proud of and that accomplishes a very specific job for your business. So it shouldn't be just like a nice to have or some other ways of putting content out there. It should be something that has a specific purpose that helps you build your business, because freelancing is a business, right? So we want to establish ourselves as the authority in our niche. First things to figure out is, do you have a niche, right? So these are a couple of questions that I've asked myself throughout the years whenever I try to narrow down what I was doing, my skill set, my different areas of expertise. So looking at the skills, knowledge, what kind of skills, knowledge, or expertise do I possess to set me apart in my field? So for me was copywriting, then UX, and then some branding, analytics, all of that stuff that I try to combine. What challenges or aspirations do my ideal client face that I can address through my podcast? And this is important to understand your client. So some research. If you don't know all these, it's highly valuable for you to do some research into that. What industries, professions, demographics do my ideal clients belong to? And this is understanding also what role are they in, right, at their companies, or what do they do? And so that you can tailor whatever you're doing to their specific needs and problems. Finally, is there an underserved or growing market within my niche that I can cater to with my podcast? And for that, you will probably look at a lot of other podcasts, whatever is already live, what's around, trying to differentiate and find your own unique angle. But more than anything, it's important to find your niche. But more than anything, what do you want to own? And this is one thing that I've learned from one of my mentors. It's Joanna Weeb, Copy Hackers. It's kind of courses, trainings for copywriters. And from her, I learned this thing of owning your thing, right? So for me, so far up to this point, I've always said I do copywriting for B2B SaaS, but what area of what I was doing did I want to be mine, right? To conquer. And in a way, it's kind of counterintuitive because a lot of freelancers think, oh, before I'm recognized for doing something, I need to put out a lot of stuff. I need people to see me as the leader. But actually, and I've learned this through doing the podcast as well. You actually have to start by deciding. Once you decide, then you can have the direction to follow that tells you what you need to do to actually become the authority in the niche. So for me, what I decided on, what I stumbled on, was I wanted to own B2B SaaS message market fit, which is a very specific way of saying combination of messaging strategy and copywriting. And I've added to it my unique twist, so with the UX angle, etc. But specifically, the way that I went about finding out what I wanted to own and the name for it was that I wanted something that my audience was familiar with. So I saw from research, from looking at social media posts, what my target clients were actually talking about. They knew the term message market fit, but at the same time, it wasn't thrown around a lot. So it was something that they had in their minds. They were somewhat familiar with, but no one actually plainly stated the term. It wasn't frequently used in a lot of places, so it was still quite niche. So you want to find that intersection between something that's known but not so well known that you hear it everywhere online, and also it's something that they need help with or struggle with. So, for example, for my clients, message market fit, it's a lot about finding the messaging that resonates with their audience. And for my SaaS clients, that's one of the main problems. So they typically struggle with finding messaging that resonates, or they struggle aligning their teams internally on messaging, or they struggle to create their customer personas, right? So between all of those things, I saw that message market fit was actually very interesting and very wasn't used a lot. So I thought it was like the sweet spot for me to go with. And also, it's a topic they're interested in because I saw that they were writing about it. I actually saw someone else using it in B2C. So that's also another angle that you could use. So seeing someone use it in a different niche or specialization that you can actually apply to your market, for example, and turn it into yours. What product do you want to build? As I mentioned, we want to build a product. The podcast should be an actual product. You should probably consider, what I did was consider my content production, podcast production, almost like the media department of my freelancing business, right? Um, so developing your podcast format and style, it's about being intentional. And these are a couple of questions that I asked myself. So for brainstorming, when I was coming up with format, name, structure, approach, what is your why for creating a podcast? And this is something that people will also ask you, or that you will use whenever you're reaching out to people to ask them to be a guest. So you need to have a why. Why are you doing this? Why is this important? For me, one thing that I've used to actually back this up was I wanted people to see how kind of obsessed with understanding people and understanding how empathizing with people and messaging customer, how obsessed I was with all of that. So at the base of my podcast idea was my kind of obsession for understanding how people think and what makes people tick. So That's an example for my case. What do I love about a podcast? So in my case, I follow, I don't know, probably 50, 60 podcasts on marketing, self-improvement, entrepreneurship, mindset. And I went back through all the podcasts that I follow and I've analyzed them and kind of tried to understand, okay, what do I like about the podcasts that I follow? What makes them podcasts that I would listen to, right? Um, and again, last questions kind of related to this. What would make this a podcast that I would stop everything to listen to? And or another way, what's a podcast that I would download on my phone and go on a 1 hour walk to listen to, right? And yeah, I think these are questions that were helpful for me to figure out, okay, this is a format that I would like to approach. These are kind of questions that I want to ask, and so on. It's good to kind of get into the mindset of the listener here. Other questions. What would make this a podcast that my audience of ICP, so ideal client or customer persona, would stop everything to listen to? So again, here I tried first to identify which personas my clients were. And from experience, I found out that they were either CMOs or VP of marketing, product marketing guys, or heads of growth, or sometimes even founders. So I went on LinkedIn, I kind of researched a lot of these roles, what they were talking about. And I've asked myself, what would make this a podcast that these guys would stop everything to listen to? Um, Also seeing what they share, a lot of the content or podcasts that they share. What are these podcasts about? What kind of formats are they in? So all of that was super helpful for me to figure out whether or not this was the way to go. What transformation do I want my listeners to go through while listening to the show? And this goes down to my experience as a copywriter. So copywriting is all about transformation, right? So in this case as well, I try to ask myself, what do I want these guys to go through when they listen to my podcast? What do I want them to learn? What I know the current situation they're in. What do I want them to be like after they've done listen to my podcast? And again, builds empathy, and I'm a lot about, as you probably understood, about understanding how other people think, which I think is super valuable here, especially if you're doing like an audio show. What product am I building here? Again, this is another question that puts you in that mindset, mental frame of thinking of the podcast as a product, something that you are building, that you're going to launch, something official, something crafted and curated, not something random that you put out like any tweet or LinkedIn post, right? So helps you pay attention to the details, I think. Other three questions. So how do I make it the product that when I promote it, I will love talking about it? So for me, it was a lot about also, I'm kind of obsessed with making things a bit nice, like curating the brand. So I have my kind of unique, fun style. I wanted my brand to be cohesive from the website to the podcast, so that was a consideration as well. But also, yeah, in general, what kind of guests do I want, right? What kind of guest will I enjoy writing about, researching, all of that stuff? What's the hook, and who's your opponent? So these are kind of questions that can help you. First, when you listen to other podcasts, you can kind of understand how they start each episode, what hooks they use, so how do they suck you into the episode and keep you engaged. So all of those considerations, and who's your opponent, so what other podcasts are in your same niche or market, and how can you stand out? So all of these are good questions that you can ask yourself if you're planning on launching a podcast. That can help you brainstorm ideas and kind of get a bit outside of what you normally would do, right? So for me, when it comes to style and format, I came up with the Message Market Fit podcast because that was my angle. And you can see kind of like an obsession for detail, kind of making it consistent, cohesive. And all of these were simple graphics that I've done using Figma. So I have my super simple templates for the fonts, nothing crazy. I just found something that fit my website style. So I'm not a designer, but I think something as consistent as simple goes a long way, even if you were not a professional designer. Or you could pay someone $5, $10 to make some graphics for you and use them as templates. And obviously, you can and should take inspiration. So one thing that I've done at the start, just because I had no idea what worked, I found this podcast, which is called Lenny's Podcast, one of the biggest podcasts in SaaS for product marketing, I think. And I literally copied the exact same formats that he used. So I went on YouTube. You can see the thumbnail follow kind of the same style. I just decided then to alternate them, but you'll see they basically have a headline, they have a photo, they have the name of the guest here. And I even, if you click on one of these videos, you'll see the graphics that they have at the beginning during the introduction and at the end of the podcast. I copied those as well. So don't feel guilty. I think it worked and I didn't have to think about anything. I knew that the guy knew their stuff because the podcast is huge. So I knew that that would have worked. Um, Formalize the details. So another important thing is to make all of these details official, just because they are going to help you when you're doing your outreach to find guests and promote the podcast. But at the same time, don't get hung up on them. So what I've done was come up with super simple, keep it simple, stupid podcast brief, super simple Google document that I will open up now. Hopefully you can see my screen. No. Never mind. I will share the file, the link after, so you can have access. But it's basically a super simple Google document with information on the podcast, who's the audience, what kind of formats the podcast is in, what kind of media I'm going to use as far as images, what's the structure and flow of the interview, and so on. So this is basically my initial presentations when at the beginning I didn't even have anything on my website, didn't have any episodes. I just created this super simple podcast brief, and I've used it, as I'll show you in a bit, to to let potential guests know what it was about and to invite them on the podcast. The tools of the trade. So this is something that a lot of people make complex, but you don't need to get fancy for this stuff. It's likely overkill. So these are the necessary must-have tools. Again, keep it simple. And it's basically just a condenser microphone that you can find on Amazon and I have links here if we're going to share the slides. But super simple condenser microphone that you can find on Amazon for like $40, 40 pounds. And it's not only going to be useful if you don't have it yet for the podcast, but it's the same exact microphone that I use for all my client calls. So though that's money well spent in a way. Streaming camera. So I use like a super simple Logitech Stream Cam or something. Again, another 30, 40 pounds. But you can totally use your phone. And actually, I think my iPhone 13 is probably better than this camera. I'm just not using it because of like logistics on my desk, but your iPhone is totally fine. Then the three kind of software tools that I would recommend are the obviously podcast hosting platform. So I'm using Simplecast. This I think it's $10 a month or something. Podcast recording platform, Squadcast, and the podcast editing platform. So the nice thing about these two, which I actually recommend, is that you only need a subscription to Descript, which is the podcast editing platform. Super easy to use. You basically edit the podcast by looking at the transcript, so you can cut out things, you can use AI, do all sorts of things. And the nice thing is that they just acquired this podcast recording platform. So these two basically come in a bundle. You get the podcast recording for free if you have Descript, which is super nice, and you don't have to pay for another podcast recording platform. So these are kind of the must-haves. And then You can have lights, you can have all sorts of fancy things, but I wouldn't recommend it. I would just recommend to stick to the basis and use stuff that you actually use for other activities in your business, for calls or recordings or whatever. Finding and booking guests in 6 steps, even if you have no podcast yet. So, what did I do at the beginning when I was starting out? Uh, when starting out, go shotguns, not sniper. So, basically, try and aim wide rather than narrow, just because you don't have the authority yet. So, what I did was sign up for a LinkedIn Sales Navigator trial, which was like 30 days, I think, and it's super handy because LinkedIn Sales Navigator allows you to filter by specific roles, to do like a very advanced search, and you can actually be a bit more specific in terms of the companies and personas that you target. So I would recommend at least a free trial of that and start with it, especially at the beginning. But then you can also just use the normal LinkedIn search. That's pretty handy as well. If you, for example, go on a company's page, you can go on their people tab, I think. You can even type in the role and it gives you the exact uh, people in their team. For example, if I type in marketing, it will give me the product marketing, the head of marketing, VP of marketing, and so on. So it's pretty handy, and you can find the role that you need for your guests. Yes. Also, at the beginning, filter for good guests. So the way that I did it at the beginning to find people who were actually relevant and interesting to have an interview with, which I actually think was kind of the secret of why I did. I've gotten a very high response. So let's say in a week I was reaching out to 10 people. I think I probably gotten a 70 or 80% response, positive response of people wanting to get on the podcast. And if you do this, you'll find out that people, especially people who are trying to build some thought leadership online, if this is your client, they love talking about what they do. And especially if it's in these kind of roles where they move around quite a lot, they like having a podcast episode where they talk about their own experience, not only about the experience at the specific company, because that podcast, it basically serves as a compendium to their CV, to their resume, right? So whenever if they need another job, they have this podcast as kind of proof of their expertise. And it's pretty handy if you think about it, right? Having some good piece of content online, well produced, that they can actually show around. So the way that I found good guests was filter out for looking at their profiles on LinkedIn and seeing were they actually actively posting content on LinkedIn, were they active, were they in my ICP role. So as I mentioned, product manager, product marketing, head of growth, VP of marketing, founders, all those. Do they talk about what your show is about? So in my case, I wanted to see that they were talking about messaging or copywriting or UX or conversion optimization, all relevant topics. And also, would you want to have them as clients? So would they be a good fit if down the line you reached out to them and asked to work with them? So all good questions to ask to filter the good ones out. And so how do you approach them? First, you send them a connection request with the relevant angle and DM. So on LinkedIn, you can do the connection request with a message or without. So I think you have for free a couple a month. So you should maximize those, but also customize your messages. So if you, as you're doing the research on their profile and you see them writing about your specific topic in your connection request, then you can reference to that specific post something like, hey, I saw you talking about message market fit and how you've done it at your company. I would like to connect. I'd be happy to connect, right? So this is a super simple first message, relevant, and shows them that you actually saw something that you were interested in and wanted to connect. Once you connect with them, so once they accept the connection request, Then you can send the first kind of official invite DM, and it doesn't need to be super specific. This was a pre-generic. So, hey, name, thanks for connecting. I'm recording a series of interviews for an up-and-coming podcast. Would you be up for coming on the show and sharing about company and how you're doing, what the podcast is about? So for me, a message like this was, would you be up for coming on the show and talking about how the name of your company is working on messaging or researching your audience? So all things that relate to my podcast. Let me know and I'll give you a bit more info. So super simple, is basically just a yes or no question here. If they say yes, obviously, if they don't say anything for a couple of weeks, follow up with another simple message like, hey, did you get a chance to consider this? Something super simple again. But if they say yes, then you can go with something like this. So, great, I'm working on a new podcast where I'm trying to better understand how, and here you can add your target client does what you do. So in my case was I'm trying to better understand how B2B SaaS companies or product marketing teams approach their messaging strategy and craft copy that converts. Um, to understand what they've tried, what has worked, and what hasn't. I'm obsessed with, and here again, this is your why, right? So we talked about the beginning, understand your why you're doing this. I'm obsessed with, in my case, was understanding how people think, what makes them tick. And I think digging into how you do it at your company would be really interesting. It would also get some good exposure for the business and yourself. Obviously, add what's in it for them as well. Each episode is about 30-40 minutes. Would you be free any of the time slots here? And you can have a Calendly link. You can also find more info in a totally non-scalable, simple Google Doc here, which is my podcast brief that I talked about earlier. And this basically gives them everything they need to make a decision, right? So typically after the message, they went ahead. Maybe a couple of people asked me a couple of questions, the clarifying questions, but typically that was it. And they went ahead and booked if they were interested. With the first 10 episodes published, then you can start going sniper and look for bigger guests. So do they have a relevant audience? You can be more fancy about it. Do you see on LinkedIn that on their posts there's a lot of engagement? If they have the bigger their audience, obviously, the more likely for them to promote your show and for other people in their network to find you and subscribe and so on. So all great benefits. Are they well connected in the industry? So if you see that they have a very important connection, someone you would like to connect to as well, that's a very good, interesting guest to have on a podcast. That's because then they can introduce you to them. Do they work at one of your dream client companies? So if you have a bucket list of client companies, then this might be your chance with your podcast authority in the background to actually start connecting with this company. And the pro tip, ask for referrals. So you can ask your past guest in your network. Yeah, at the end of every podcast, what I do is basically ask, hey, do you know anyone else who would be a good fit to come on the podcast? And typically, again, 80-90% of the times they have someone to refer, and basically just gives me another people booked on the podcast without me having to send any messages. LinkedIn DM intros are great for this. So a good thing about LinkedIn is that a lot of my past podcast guests introduced me to someone in the network through LinkedIn, so they can do a group DM, group message, and they can introduce you to people directly from there. So you don't even have to use email. It's a bit easier and also more user-friendly in a way, and more like a seamless experience. So I think that's kind of like an underused way to connect with people. A note on dealing with guests. So the best way to get better and better guests, from my experience, is to be a good host and conduct great interviews. So how do you do it? Show them that you care, and this comes through in your process, in how you treat them, the expectations that you set, and we walk through that in a bit. research the hell out of them. So I typically do 1 hour of research for each podcast, and I set that for every Monday. So I listen, read, watch their content and other interviews they've done, if they've done any, ask questions that never been asked. So I try to dig into some things that they never been asked on other interviews, or they that they've written maybe on LinkedIn, but no one actually pointed out a lot. So I want to dig deeper into that, and also ask personal questions. Those I found work super well, just because people kind of tend to melt a little bit when you ask the questions, and I typically keep them for the end of the podcast, kind of like the last one or two questions, and people are super surprised by those, and it's create kind of like a positive experience for all of us. All right, editing, promoting, and repurposing a podcast. Let's fly through this. It's already been 30 minutes plus, so you're busy, so make it easy. Optimize everything. So the way that I do it, typically, this is my kind of schedule and process in a way. So I blocked 1 day for research, as I mentioned, 1 hour for each episode. And I think I limited my slots for podcasts to only my two call days, which are Tuesday and Thursdays. And I think I have one or two episodes potentially that people could book per day. So one block day for research, that's my Monday in the morning. That's when I do all my podcast research. So if I have a podcast recording on Thursday or Tuesday, Monday is blocked for research. So I know that by the time that recording will happen, I have already done my research. One block day for editing and publishing. With experience, it will be done in 2-3 hours. This is typically Fridays for me. So I publish my podcast episode on Wednesdays. So every Friday before that, that's when I edit the episode. I basically prepare it for publication, and I also create all the content from there that I'll show you in a bit. Create playbooks as you go. For this, I recommend a book called Buy Back Your Time by Dan Martell. Really good book on productivity and scaling things. So playbooks are basically just me filming whatever I'm doing, screencast like Loom or something. And basically, once you have the video, you can even use AI to turn all like the transcript of the video into action steps, into checklists that then basically becomes an SOP called playbook. But you don't have to do all the fancy work of like creating all the details. It's basically ready once you have the video and a simple checklist. So super easy, super simple, and I've done it for all my processes. Use checklist to avoid thinking. Again, all my editing and publishing, I go through a super simple checklist, like one of those plane pilots, going through a checklist so they know that everything's covered. I don't even have to think about the process, what comes first, after. You create templates to keep it consistent. So this is mostly for content, all the content pieces that I produce. Use AI, as I mentioned, and schedule and batch content up front. So this is an example. My calendar blocks, so you can see on what this. Yeah, so this is basically my research on Monday, and this is kind of the podcast publication that I have and editing. My playbooks, these are super simple examples of playbooks. So I have guest research, I have the podcast editing and publishing. So you can see I basically attach Loom videos, and then I have the steps and with a checklist and links to any documents that I need. Create templates. So I create templates for the WordPress post and show notes of the podcast. So I basically just duplicate every post and I have to replace different blocks. The podcast page, the YouTube description, the LinkedIn social media post, the podcast intro and outro, and the podcast and episode graphics. All of those are basically templatized. I just copied for each episode and I replaced with the new content. For creating and scheduling, so I use Buffer, which is a platform that lets you create and schedule posts for different social media platforms in one. And I even use the free plan, which is pretty awesome because it lets you publish on 3 platforms. So for me, these 3 platforms are LinkedIn, Instagram, and YouTube. I used to use Twitter X, but then I stopped because I saw that it wasn't there wasn't a lot of engagement, and plus LinkedIn for my audience is the most used platform. So in your case, you would have to see where they hang out the most, and YouTube also because I'm doing an audio and video podcast. Type of post. So for me, the posts that I schedule for promotion are 3 video shorts. So from the main video podcast, I extract 3 shorts that I have in portrait mode, so vertical, and I reschedule them in buffer on again YouTube, Instagram, and LinkedIn. So with that, I might write like a very short post that goes with every short video, and then I just add it to buffer and schedule it for the week after, so they're done. One another post is the photo top 5 lessons. This is basically just the cover of the episode, and I post this when the episode comes out on Wednesdays. Photo of the cover of the episode with a post that basically it's the top 5 lessons from this episode. And this is a longer post, but it's basically the post when the podcast goes live. And also, you should study your audience and see what works, right? So if you have other similar podcast in your niche, look at what type of content they produced from the podcast, what type of content gets the most engagement, and so on. So always kind of a testing game. This is a quick example of what you will see in buffer. So these are my posts. You can see this is a short. This on Wednesday, it's the image post with the cover of the podcast, and then other 2 shorts. So the 3 shorts plus the one. And it's also a super nice thing because before doing the podcast, I always struggle to post daily, to write stuff daily. The podcast basically removes any barrier that you might have or any obstacle or mental block to creating content because you have the content, you just need to put it out, right? So it's also a good thing in terms of being consistent with the publishing and producing content. This is just examples of what it looks like on Instagram. So you can see for each episode, I have a short like this one that goes out, image, 2 shorts, and then it starts again, another short, and so on. LinkedIn, this is an example of the top 5 lessons, and this is what it looks like on YouTube. For YouTube, the other side benefit of doing shorts is that the shorts get the views that attracts new people to the channel. If you only post these longer videos with the full podcast, you will not get new views. The shorts is what gets you the new views, and then you get subscribers through those. It's basically the shorts give you exposure even to people who are not subscribed, which is great. Curate launch week and a day. So this is, again, as I mentioned, my schedule. Pick one day for go live. Wednesdays for me. I picked Wednesdays because typically the best day to engage with people on a week, it's Tuesday, but I wanted something a bit after midweek, so they were kind of engaged, but they didn't have a lot of stuff on their minds already. So kind of like a nice midweek point where they might be a bit freer of commitments, and they might have some time to listen to the podcast or at least to bookmark it. Let the guest know the previous week. So what I do here, which I find super helpful, every Friday, whenever I'm editing and publishing my podcast, what I do is at the beginning of the podcast, I have a quick teaser, which is basically 3 snippets of the podcast, and then I have my introduction. I record a screenshot of the teaser plus the introduction. I cut that screencast video and I send it to the guest saying something like, hey, name, hey, Mark, next week it's time for you to go live. Here's just a quick teaser. Like, I find that it gets them excited and gets them in the mindset of being ready to promote the podcast. So it's a nice thing that doesn't cost me much. And I started doing it. It works very well. Interact in the comment section. So if on LinkedIn you add the link to the podcast in your comments, don't forget to interact with anyone who actually adds any comments on social media or YouTube. On launch day, DM the guest. So this is another thing. that I do, and I send them on Wednesdays or Wednesdays whenever the podcast goes live. I send them a DM or an email wherever we talked about the first time. Something like, "Hey, I'm happy to announce that a podcast episode is now live. Thanks for your wonderful conversation episode. I look forward to promoting it like crazy. Here's the link to the show notes, and here I link to my website because I want them to share my website, not other podcast platform. I want my website to be shared and be spread around with links to podcast platforms, YouTube, going the YouTube video I posted for a bit later. I'll be sharing shorts and posts over the next 3 days, so setting expectations, and I might tag you just to point the audience to your LinkedIn page. I'd be super grateful if you'd like to share with your peers community. It would really help spread the word and grow the podcast so I can have you back with a massive audience next time. If you think of anything I can do for you, either now or even a few months down the line, please let me know how I can help. I'd be honored to help. Again, here it's about being super selfless, never think about what's in it for me, just put stuff out and try to be as helpful as possible. That's kind of the mindset that I always try to have whenever I post things. What about the results? So it's not an overnight success. Building a brand and owning a niche takes time. So as I mentioned, I started this in February. So it's February, March, April, May. So it's been like 4 months, and I've already seen a lot of good results in terms of my audience. But the kind of the nice benefits are people notice you and start paying attention. You get more relevant, useful connections, so that you'll see it, especially on LinkedIn first. Before this, I used to see a lot of other copywriters or web designers adding me on LinkedIn. Since I started doing the podcast, I'm seeing more product marketers, more VP of marketing, more heads of growth, more founders adding me on LinkedIn, which means that they see what I'm doing and it's helpful for them and that they want to connect, which is super nice. You become a connector. Again, you can introduce people to other people through a podcast. You expand your network with relevant connections. You create relationships based on trust. Just because people hear you and they kind of learn about you, they kind of feel like they already know you just by listening to you. So that's a very intimate connection the podcast creates. Your name and brand spread around. Just because everything's connected to your brand, it should be connected if you do it well. Your online presence grows exponentially through all my social. I'm seeing wherever I post, especially I would say YouTube is a big one. So if you do the video, I think it's probably going to be a bit better as well. And finally, this is a super big one for me. You learn a lot, and this gives you confidence, right? I used to be freaking terrorized of jumping on calls with clients or with people in general, right? And in part through doing the work with clients, but also I think with the podcast, it gave me a lot of confidence to just being able to speak, being able to ask better questions, being able to listen to people, and general learn a lot about my clients, right? Because before doing the podcast, I've always wondered, it would be nice to, like pick the brain of some of my clients and understand what they're going through, what their challenges are. And I had no way of doing that apart from maybe asking past clients or try writing a random post on, I don't know, on a community or a Slack channel where my target audience was hanging out. But it was impossible. With the podcast, I basically have the freedom of asking any type of questions that's on my mind to my potential clients. I can dig into their pains. I can dig into their challenges. I can see how they do things. I can see where they might need my help. So it's about understanding them, but also understanding how you can help them. So that's another super good positive side benefit. Bonus, you can find partners and collaborators, so other people that I interview in the podcast. It's not only my potential clients, it's also other experts in the field. So I just today, tomorrow I'm publishing an episode with a copywriter that I've been following since I started out in 2016, which is amazing. I've learned a lot just by interviewing him. And Obviously, they have a super relevant audience because they are in my same exact field. I've interviewed someone else in the growth marketing space, always related to my clients. Uh, yeah, in general, you basically can find people who can partner with you or can refer to their own clients, or you could refer to your own clients and so on. So it's a nice give and take. You can send your podcast audience to other own media. So if you have a newsletter, I also have a newsletter. So I always try to interlink my podcast, newsletter, YouTube, everything that I do. I have links to everything. You can do podcast exchanges and get interviews. So I just interviewed another podcast host, pretty UX writing podcast. He was on my podcast, and I after the interview, he sent me a link to book to go on his podcast. Right, so you can do exchanges, which is very nice. And you become a better speaker and listener. So this was another one of my goals, to become a better speaker, listener, to just open up to people, understand how they think. So this was another great benefit. Yeah, again, so these are just some screenshots showing like very slow growth. One thing that I wish I've done at the beginning was to publish those shorts, and always remember to post those shorts in full width. I used to post like half, like basically the video just in the middle of the vertical post, and those gave me, I don't know, probably 20% of the views. From the moment that I expanded the the view of the video to the full screen in vertical, I'm basically getting 90% more views. So it's very those very little details that you will only learn by doing things and trying things out. And this is pretty much it. Obviously, it's been 4 months, but I'm seeing a lot of good things happen, a lot of great connections. And as I mentioned, podcast gives you access to people, to relationships, which I think in today's world, which is everything's becoming more commoditized, I think it's kind of an unfair advantage. And I would recommend everyone to at least think about how to do it. Pretty much it. If you guys have any questions, I'm open.
Thank you, Chris. Are there any questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself or just type it in the chat window. In the meantime, I can ask a question I am really curious of. What was the most challenging bit for you, Chris? Is it finding the leads or getting the tech right? So when you start, because right now I guess everything is much more natural, but in terms of the first challenge, what would you say?
Yeah, the first challenge is, which is probably common for freelancers, is to make sure that you keep marketing going even when you're stuffed with client work, right? Because the first thing that comes natural is, okay, this week I'm packed with client work, I will just delegate the podcast. But if you commit to it, you need to be consistent, because that's the name of the game, right? Consistency. If you decide to do something, you have to stick with it. Even you have to be good at planning around it. For so client will have to wait, but it's important, I think, to designate at least a couple of hours a week, half a day at least, to doing some marketing and some content. And I think, and this is also quite good, because it's once you have the system going, it becomes repeatable and quite easy to maintain.
Thank you. We have a question from Isabel about your explanation of the short video. So could you say what exactly it is, a short video? What do you mean?
Yeah, so I can actually show you. Tell me if you see my screen. Can you see my screen here?
Yes, it is currently showing your YouTube studio.
Yeah. All right. So for example, these are the normal YouTube videos. So this is the full podcast, right? And it looks like this. Interview, I have like a teaser at the beginning, then my introduction of the guest, and then the full interview and so on. So this is the full podcast, but for each podcast episode, I also produce the shorts, which are these ones. So these are basically the vertical videos. So from that podcast, you can see that I have these 3 shorts created. For another podcast, another 3, another 3. So it's always those 3 plus the podcast. So as I mentioned, I used to do it this way, which kind of sucks, where basically because it would save me some time to just do it this way, just because I didn't have to resize the video every time. But you see, basically the video is just in the middle and everything else around. But once I started publishing them this way, so full screen, which is basically just dragging the video full screen, super easy actually to do, you can see that these videos have a lot more views. So this is basically the full screen. And the other one that I was saying, you probably didn't see that as well, was this one. So this is the other kind, right? So this wasn't get almost any views. And as soon as I turn those into this type, like the bigger ones, it was much better, larger. But yeah, that's basically the idea. So those three shorts are the kind of the content that I post on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and on Wednesday, which is the when it goes live, I have just the cover of the podcast with the top 5 lessons.
A bit of a straight one, but I mean, it's obviously been really good for building your profile and your brand. But if you don't mind me asking, like, how much sort of actual kind of work has it led to? Not obviously in terms of income, but just how many projects have you actually generated?
So
so
I can tell you,
quite new that you've been doing this for like 2-3 months, right?
Yeah, for months, but I can tell you it led to like a big project that's gonna take me busy for like until end of August probably. So that was good. Like even if it's the thing that I found from it, even if it's you get, I don't know, 1 or 2 projects, the simple fact that you're doing a podcast that's super relevant to what you're doing, it gives you very qualified leads, let's say. So I hope to know how much it costs roughly to record, edit, publish 1 episode. I mean, most of the cost is the tools and then my time, obviously. So for me, because now so far I've been doing it myself, I'm working on probably getting an executive assistant for other stuff as well, and I'll probably have them do everything. But for now, it's just me. I started, it was taking a couple, like 4 or 5 hours to edit and publish all the content for the week after. Now I'm probably optimized to 2 hours to 3 hours maximum. So it's basically my time for those 2-3 hours, and then the total cost of the tools and equipment, which I don't know, it might be a month, maybe $50 a month if you sum it up. Yeah, it's not super expensive at all. And I mean, I also use AI tools, but I use them for my work as well. So I don't consider them strictly cost for podcast.
Are the AI tools that you use the research tools for podcasters, or is there I've heard of a tool before, I don't remember the name, but I don't remember there's a special one for podcasters to help
No. I just use ChatGPT. So the AI tools that I use are ChatGPT, Claude, and actually there's one that's really good that you could just use that and it's free. It's Gemini 1.5 Pro by Google. So if you access the Google AI Studio, you can get this nice interface, and basically it's a free AI tool, super powerful because you can upload huge documents, like entire podcast transcript, and you can find the exact quotes that you want. You can export them and post them on your show notes. So all of that, super helpful, and it's free.
Oh, that's a great tip. Thank you. So thank you very much for speaking, Chris. Thank you much for joining to my lovely audience, and see you soon at some other event.
Thank you for having me.